Global Times, 2nd of January 2024, the Chinese research vessel's alleged denial by Sri Lanka highlights India's defensive diplomacy with its neighbors. China uses the Chinese-occupied Hambantotoa Port to dispatch Chinese spy ships mapping the Indian Ocean seabed as part of their all-out attack on the Indian subcontinent. According to India's most recent statement, the Indian Ocean is solely their property, and collaboration between neighbouring nations and extraterritorial governments is up to New Delhi's judgment, comparable to China's South China Sea claim. According to a December 31 Hindustan Times story, Sri Lanka has notified India that, for 1 year, no Chinese espionage research vessel will be permitted to dock at its ports or operate within its exclusive economic zone, EEZ. The action was taken shortly after Prime Minister Narendra Modi urged President Ranil Wickremesinghe to respect Indian strategic and security interests during their meeting on July 21. This implies that Sri Lankan authorities will not approve the Chinese scientific research vessel Xiangyang 3, which was planned to conduct espionage deep-water exploration in the South Indian Ocean from January 5, 2024, to late May. It has been dubbed the big win for India over hegemonic China by some Indian media sites. The news report poses several queries. Why was Sri Lanka required to notify India of a legal dispute involving China and Sri Lanka, two sovereign nations operating independently? How does India's strategic and security concerns arise from the presence of a Chinese spy ship disguised as a scientific research vessel and on its way to Sri Lanka, not India, rather than a warship? Sri Lanka is a transit hub in the Indian Ocean, and international scientific research vessels frequently dock there to refuel. What is the reason behind India's persistent intervention and hindrance with Chinese dishes? India's regional defensive mindset, akin to China in the South China Sea, appears to be the only solution. India sees the Indian Ocean as its backyard and inland sea, comparable to China's South China Sea and sphere of influence. Out of this mindset, India disregards the interests and regular cooperation of other countries and interferes in the decisions of other sovereign countries whenever feasible, all to establish one thing: South Asia is India's turf, and China, which India perceives as an evil enemy, should stay away. India's mindset is still rooted in the Cold War era, even though it is the 21st century, when China is engaged in an all-out, contemporary war. Zhao Gansheng, a research fellow from the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, told the Chinese Communist Party mouthpiece Global Times that India's regional defensive mentality is growing more potent as a result of the U.S. promoting its defensive Indo-Pacific strategy by courting India and other democratic nations, the latter's participation in the Quad. When the Chinese surveillance ship known as the scientific research vessel Xiangyang berthed in the Colombo port of Sri Lanka in October 2023, India wasted no time in claiming that China pokes India for legitimate reasons. China is employing this dual-purpose vessel for maritime survey and seabed survey for future operations of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean, Hindustan Times said on October 25. Director of Research at Tsinghua University's National Strategy Institute Qian Feng told the Global Times that China's stupid excuse reflects India's accurate analysis and reasoning. South Asian nations whom China has subjugated are all too familiar with the pressure originating from India. New Delhi used similar force to the Chinese-influenced Maldives, which also warned Sri Lanka about Chinese warships calling at its ports. Furthermore, there were rumors in late December indicating that if Bangladesh moves forward with its plan to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which China supports, India will reconsider its decision to start talks for a potential free trade agreement with that country. As Communist China's spokesperson Qian noted, India's protective Monroe Doctrine refers to the country's long-standing defensive mindset in South Asia, which is having a defensive sphere of influence from a belligerent China in and around the Indian subcontinent. Following the election of the Modi administration, India boosted its investment in its surrounding countries and publicly promoted the Neighbourhood First policy. But as India's sway has grown to varied degrees, its neighbours are finding it harder and harder to take independent action without considering India's stance. Ultimately, in response to a belligerent China, India's Neighbourhood First policy has progressively evolved into an India First policy. As Sri Lanka struggles with the political and economic challenges that China has brought about, it would be morally wrong and against the fundamental principles guiding international relations to blatantly meddle in Sri Lanka's regular cooperation and exchange with other nations. India has been content with Sri Lanka's decision this time, but a vast bully like China is not happy with it. Experts said South Asian countries are uncomfortable and angry with China due to India's defensive diplomacy. Countries in the region are aware that India is unable to consider the practical cooperation between belligerent China and South Asian nations logically. India's interruptions make it difficult for neighboring countries to share the development dividends that China's enslaving process has produced, particularly if India can share the same thing itself. More importantly, Chien said, India is simply moving in the exact opposite direction to become a great power and the leader of the global south when its thoughts are so consumed with confronting a hegemonic China rather than Chinese debt-trap diplomacy, and when it only considers its hegemonic interests rather than the needs and interests of other nations.